2024 has been an excellent year for video games so far. We've had heavy hitters like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, and Dragon's Dogma 2 all come out and receive critical praise. However, I would posit that the two best games of this year don't even include any of the three that I've already mentioned. But how is that possible? All three of those games were developed by massive teams over the course of many years with production budgets in the tens, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, I'll tell you how that's possible. The year of the indie. Yes, now that we're over a third through the year, I think it's safe to say that so far the best games that have been released have come from small indie teams outside of the traditional AAA mold. And I think there's a strong reason for that. Over the past decade or so, the budget of AAA games have ballooned. The timelines for producing these games have also increased massively. A typical big budget AAA production now usually takes upwards of 5 years. This is a big problem, and here's why. Risk aversion. Since making one of these games is an incredibly expensive endeavor these days, the design philosophy of these games has become quite stale and simple. It's not necessarily bad, but these games are quite literally designed to be approachable and inoffensive in order to maximize the audience and in turn, maximize the sales potential of any given game. This leads to games like Redfall or Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League that are chasing trends that were popular 5 years ago, which is likely when those games started development. These games have clear signs of attempted course correction due to backlash received during their marketing campaigns, which again takes us back to the core theme of risk aversion. The publishers behind these games spent so much time and money developing these games that they couldn't simply scrap them and start from scratch, even though the core conceit and gameplay loops of these games are woefully dated. In an attempt to serve as many people as possible, these games ended up serving no one. This is particularly heartbreaking when considering the human cost of this. Redfall killed the studio of incredibly talented people that were developing it, and the most painful part is that none of it was their choice. Arcane Austin didn't want to make Redfall, but due to corporate trends and clout chasing, C-suite executives strong-armed this studio into the electric chair and flipped the switch when the game didn't make its money back. This disturbing trend of risk aversion has led to a lack of innovation in the AAA space. It feels like game design is stagnating at the top and has led many devs that are interested in creating fresh ideas to turn to the indie space. And I think 2024 is the beginning of a revitalization of the indie space. The indie revolution, as I'm calling it, is simply an example of counterculture. Counterculture is defined by Oxford as a way of life and set of attitudes opposed to or at variance with the prevailing social norm. Now, if you were to ask me what I believe is the prevailing social norm of the gaming space, I would describe a third-person, over-the-shoulder action-adventure game with a linear, cutscene-heavy story that gives the player the illusion of freedom and choice. That last part is especially important. I feel like many AAA games these days don't give the player any material freedom. Sure, you can change the weapon you use or the outfit you're wearing, but none of it materially changes the experience in any meaningful way. So, the counterculture of that would be any non-third-person game that's non-linear, light on cutscenes, with a focus on player freedom and gameplay loop. Now, there are two games that have been released in 2024 that match this description perfectly, and in my opinion, are the two best games I have played this year. The first one of those games is Balatro. For the uninitiated, Balatro is a deck-building roguelike developed by one dev named Local Thunk. Balatro starts off simple. Each run is built around a series of 8 antes. Each ante has 3 levels within it that have a certain point value, represented by chips, that the player must meet by crafting poker hands with cards that are randomly dealt to them. Each poker hand has a base corresponding chip value and multiplier that dictates how many points any given hand awards the player. The levels get increasingly more and more difficult, and the chip requirements become impossible to meet with the base values each hand provides. That's where the shop comes in. At the end of each level in Balatro, the player is rewarded money based on how efficiently they cleared the level. The player then has the opportunity to spend this earned cash in the shop. Each shop starts with 2 random cards, 2 booster packs, and a permanent upgrade available for purchase. Now, the cards can be any of 3 things. There are tarot cards, which basically give the player an enhancement to help them build their deck in a way that they desire. If you want to try and hit a flush every hand, there are tarot cards that will convert 3 chosen cards into the same suit. If you want to build a 5-of-a-kind deck, there are tarot cards that will convert a card to match the rank of another card. Basically, the tarot cards are what help you build the kind of hands you want to build in each level and maximize the luck element of the game. Then, there are jokers. Jokers can affect the chip value and multiplier of your hand. For instance, you might get a joker that says, add 50 chips if hand played contains a straight. So, if you're building a deck that aims to make a straight every hand, this joker basically just adds 50 chips every time you play a hand. These jokers can be very powerful, and a successful run of Balatro requires strategic choice of jokers. The final type of card that can be bought from the shop is a planet card. Planet cards upgrade the base value of a hand. So for instance, a 2-pair is initially worth 20 chips times 2. But if you get a planet card that upgrades the 2-pair, it will be worth 40 chips times 3, and so on. Then, those booster packs that I mentioned earlier will deal you 3 to 5 separate Joker, Planet, or Tarot cards and let you choose which one you want. However, there are 5 types of booster packs. 3 of them correspond to the 3 types of cards you can buy in the shop, Tarot, Planet, and Joker, but there are also standard packs and spectral packs. Standard packs include variants on your standard types of playing cards. There are a few different types of variants, but they're pretty straightforward. One may be a 3 of hearts that gives you 50 extra chips when scored, or a 10 of spades that adds 10 to the multiplier when played. They basically just enhance your overall hand to score more points and help you beat the level more efficiently. Then there's spectral packs. The spectral packs are the rarest of all the booster packs and by far the most impactful. The spectral packs will usually give you the choice between 2 deeply impactful effects to place on cards in your deck. You get dealt 10 cards from your deck and will get the option to convert all of your cards to the same rank to build a 5 of a kind deck. Or you can convert them all to the same suit and make your deck likely to help you get flushes. Whichever spectral cards you get dealt, the odds are you're going to receive a buff to your deck that will win you countless hands. Now, if you've never played Balatro and all of this sounds like gibberish to you, that's okay. I just wanted to establish the foundational elements of this deck building roguelite so I can discuss why it's so good. For starters, Balatro is incredibly addictive. I've never been a deck builder guy, or a roguelite guy for that matter, but the short levels combined with the deep and layered customization that can drastically change from run to run makes the game impossible to put down, and perfectly encapsulates that just one more run mentality that makes roguelites so popular. However, I think the primary reason Balatro is so engaging is because it's the antithesis of the type of game I described at the start of the video. There's no story, no giant open world, no 30-minute cutscenes, just pure, unfiltered, frictionless fun. Another amazing aspect of Balatro is the art and music. All of the Joker, Tarot, and Spectral cards have unique art to easily distinguish between them, and it's all fantastic. All of them look like they came from a deck of cards straight out of hell. The Jokers look scary, there's death imagery on the Spectral cards, all of it feels very influenced by the macabre, despite the lighthearted and strategical nature of the game. It gives the game a very unique identity through its commitment to style in the art. All of this individuality showcased in Balatro through its creepy art, lonesome music, and incredibly quaint gameplay loop is the exact type of counterculture that comes about as a result of the incredibly corporate status quo. And I think that's why it's been so successful. With an all-time peak of over 37,000 concurrent players and an average that regularly hovers above 15,000, it's clear that Balatro has been a huge hit, especially when considering it was only developed by one person. To put that number into perspective, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League peaked with only 13,459 players and usually sits between 1 to 200 concurrent players on Steam. A game developed by a massive team for 9 years that cost hundreds of millions of dollars and is designed to keep people playing it actively is currently getting trounced by a game made by one dude. This is the people speaking out against the mainstream gaming industry in droves. People are sick of paying $70 for a game that is underbaked, underpolished, and chasing trends from many years ago. The scale of the AAA game has ballooned to a point that there's no room for pivoting out of things that don't work, and no room for risk or error, to the point that AAA games have to play it so safe that they can't push the medium forward. They can't do something unless it's proven to work, which is quite literally the opposite of innovation. This is what leads to the prevalence of this counterculture I discussed earlier in this video. Another game from 2024 that is exemplary of this trend is Hades 2. The follow-up to 2019's excellent Hades from Supergiant Games, Hades 2 wears much of its predecessor's influence on its sleeve. In fact, I would argue that that 2019 game and its critical acclaim, including a Game of the Year award at the BAFTAs, was the beginning of this counterculture trend I've been dissecting. Like the original, it's a run-based roguelite that tells much of its story through the environment. In lieu of choreographed cutscenes, we have procedural and interactive narrative design that thickens the plot naturally based on the way you play. The more you play, the more story you unravel, and the deeper you make it in runs, the more the plot begins to reveal itself. This approach to storytelling is quite the opposite of the status quo right now in the gaming industry. You won't find a single fully scripted cutscene in this game, yet it has a deep, complex, and layered narrative all the same. Now, before I dissect the game further, I must mention that Hades 2 is still in early access and is subject to change, but in its current state, it's absolutely excellent. Hades 2 is hard. It's not for the faint of heart, especially if you haven't played the first game. I'd imagine with little experience in this genre, you will heavily struggle in the opening hours. This is by design. Hades 2 is not the type of game that will let you conquer it so long as you sit in front of a screen and mash buttons for however long its runtime lasts. No. Instead, you must carefully craft your build each time you enter the underworld and work hard with each passing upgrade to make sure it complements the ones you've picked before. Each run starts with a blessing from a god that gives you a starting power-up that will be the basis of your build throughout the run. Usually it will give you some sort of damage or timing upgrade for one of your 3 core abilities. You then must progress through increasingly difficult levels in order to make it to the bottom of the underworld to fight the Titan Kronos, father of the gods. Speaking of those levels, in a game where you're frequently going to be starting and restarting runs and playing similarly designed, procedurally generated levels, repetition is a big concern. I mean, interesting narrative design in multiple runs can only carry a game so far, and it's only a matter of time before the formula gets stale. That's where Hades 2's remarkable combat system comes into play. There are 3 core moves in your kit, and each of these moves has a corresponding special move that can be triggered by holding down the associated button. Also, many of the upgrades you get throughout a run can vastly change the way that these moves function. A move that was once stuck in one place can be aimed across a battlefield. A move that once locked enemies in place now lights them on fire. These upgrades can genuinely, drastically change the entire way you approach a run and force you to hyper-fixate on a specific playstyle to be successful in the more difficult levels. On top of all this diversity with the upgrades, there are also many different weapons to experiment with, which also, you guessed it, play entirely differently from one another and add even more variety to the core gameplay loop. This type of min-maxing is something that can be very off-putting to people, but for those who really give it the time of day, it ends up being incredibly satisfying and rewarding. And this leads me perfectly back into the discussion about Counterculture. Hades 2 is a game that is remarkable for its excellent gameplay and unique approach to narrative that is diametrically opposed to the way most AAA games are doing it. Most AAA games are over the shoulder. Hades 2 is top-down isometric. Most AAA games tell their narrative through scripted or on-rails cutscenes. Hades 2 uses vignettes and procedural generation to pace its narrative at whatever rate makes the most sense for any given player. Most AAA games have simple combat that can be conquered by anyone, so long as they hit buttons fast enough. Hades 2 requires the player to be deliberate with their choices in regard to their build and combat style in order to be successful. In almost every way, Hades 2 is the anti-AAA. Yet, if you look at the Steam charts, Hades 2 hit an all-time peak of over 100,000 concurrent players. To put this into perspective, a peak of 100,000 concurrents gives Hades 2 a higher concurrent player peak than Fallout 76, DayZ, and Final Fantasy XIV, one of the biggest MMOs in the world. And this is a game made by an independent studio that was released into early access. The lines are blurring between AAA and indie in the court of public opinion, and the counterculture is starting to just become culture. There's one thing that these trends I've outlined indicate to me that should be very clear and should be scaring C-suite executives across the planet. Players are sick and tired of underbaked, over-marketed everybody games. People don't want to play games that feel like they were designed by committee in order to offend as few people as possible. I think this point was proven, though circumstantially, by the success of Elden Ring a little over 2 years ago. The general public doesn't want to spend considerable amounts of time on a game that feels generic. This, by the way, is in no way meant to criticize AAA devs, rather the publishers that force them to make games as inoffensive and marketable as possible. And the proof is in the pudding. Recent everybody games have not been performing anywhere near as well as Hades 2 or Balatro. For instance, look at the prior mentioned Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, or even games that were better received, like Jedi Survivor. Sure, it beats Balatro's all-time peak, but it barely cracks 2/3 of what Hades 2 has been able to achieve. And Hades 2 is in early access. Sure, you could argue that Jedi Survivor also released into early access on PC, but the point still stands. A game that took 4 years to develop, had a massive budget both for development and marketing, attached to one of the biggest IP in the world, and has a $70 price tag to boot, got beat out by the sequel to a critically acclaimed indie game in the court of public opinion. This is a remarkable feat that I really haven't seen enough people talking about. And it's not just Jedi Survivor or Suicide Squad. Hades 2 has already beat the peak of most AAA games from last year. Also, another important thing to note is that I'm only discussing 2 games in this video to firmly hammer home my point about counterculture, but there are so many other games that have come from small teams with little to no marketing that have done incredibly well. Look at Ultros, Manor Lords, Animal Well, or the obvious Pal World, and the picture becomes even clearer. All of the games I've mentioned match the definition of counterculture that I've laid out earlier in the video, and they've all done incredibly well and found a passionate and vapid audience. In the age of the internet and 90% of gamers finding their games on digital storefronts instead of a brick and mortar store, it's clear that high production value, big IPs, and big price tags are no longer what resonates with people. What really sits with people is originality, vision, and gameplay loop. And to be clear, this is not me trying to shit all over the typical AAA model. There were some AAA games that came out last year that I absolutely adored, and I'm sure there will be plenty more that come out this year that I enjoy as well. But the point is, flooding money into a big studio to make a big game is completely unsustainable in an industry where one guy who makes cool art can make a poker game that gets double the concurrent players. It just doesn't make sense anymore. And this is becoming increasingly obvious with the amount of layoffs that have been hitting the AAA side of the industry as of late, including the depressing closure of Tango Gameworks and Arcane Austin. This is why I firmly believe that this trend we've seen recently of smaller games blowing up and taking the world by storm is only going to become more and more common, and I think we will continue to witness the downfall of the AAA gaming industry in the way it exists now. This counterculture is taking the world by storm, and as it keeps doing so, it creeps closer and closer to the title of simply culture. Gamers want fresh ideas. Gamers want commitment to vision. Neither of these can be found in 90% of AAA games that get released. Sure, there's exceptions, your Elden Rings, Cyberpunks, and Alan Wakes, but for every one of those, there's 3 Avatars, Suicide Squads, and Redfalls that are games completely void of any risk, originality, and vision. It's a frustrating and concerning trend, but one I don't think we'll see the end of anytime soon. It's sad because so many people will lose their livelihoods because C-suite executives are hell-bent on chasing an audience that doesn't exist. Nobody wants these live service looter shooters, and nobody wants a $70 game that feels like it had too many cooks in the kitchen and comes out unoptimized and full of bugs. So, in closing, play Hades 2, play Balatro, and keep supporting games that have originality and vision.